The focus, on the first 100 days of a presidency actually began 92 years ago with the first 100 days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency in 1933, in the depth of the Great Depression. It was a worldwide economic depression caused to some degree by the Republican president, Herbert Hoover, signing into law a Republican tariff bill pushed through the Congress by Senator Reed Smoot and Congressman Willis Hawley. President Roosevelt did more in his first 100 days than any other president in history, more to build back the economy of this country with a flood of legislation and executive action that stabilized the banking system that was on the verge of collapse, delivered new employment opportunities for workers, basically created the shape of the modern economy that we have all been living with since. Donald Trump is in his 94th day, and his presidency is sinking lower than any previous presidency in its 94th day. Donald Trump has scared a lot of people. Donald Trump has heaped cruelty on people, but not as much cruelty as he wants to. Donald Trump's mass deportation plan is a complete failure at the mass level. We have not seen mass deportations. We have seen relatively small deportations with some glaringly stupid, cruel, illegal, and unconstitutional mistakes that they have made. We have seen the most dramatic stock market crash ever caused by a single human being. And today, Donald Trump is effectively trying to have the United States switch sides in the middle of a war. The war the man he admires and has called a genius, Vladimir Putin, started in Ukraine. Donald Trump said he would end the war in Ukraine on the first day of his presidency. He's in the 94th consecutive day of failure on that promise to end the war in Ukraine on the first day. He has failed every day on the economy, and he has surrounded himself with the most incompetent cabinet the White House and White House's advisors in history, and the public, including Trump voters, have noticed and have turned on Donald Trump. There will be some Trump voters who support Donald Trump until the end, just as there were some Nixon voters who supported Richard Nixon after articles of impeachment were drawn up against him and after he resigned from the presidency and accepted a pardon for crimes committed during his presidency. But the marginal voter who made Donald Trump, that swing voter who made Donald Trump president, has now turned against Donald Trump. If those voters voted for Donald Trump because they believed China would pay his tariffs, they now know that they have to pay those tariffs. They have learned the hard way that they have to pay those tariffs, and they don't like it. And so Donald Trump's power is slipping and could slip away if the polling disaster Donald Trump is personally facing right now tonight spreads to Republicans in the Senate and the House facing re-election next year. Donald Trump will never face re-election again in his life, but Republican senators will. And if their polling numbers start to get as bad as Donald Trump's, they will then be able to abandon Donald Trump because they have never actually feared Donald Trump. Republican senators and House members have always feared Donald Trump's voters. They have always feared Donald Trump's voters throwing them out of their jobs. The vividness of the incompetence in Donald Trump's cabinet, from a Treasury Secretary who gets in screaming matches in the White House with the richest person in the world because the richest person in the world is seizing the department that's supposed to be run by the Treasury Secretary, to the inane babblings of a Commerce Secretary who promised people that the Tesla stock price would go up and urged them to buy Tesla stock, something that no previous member of a cabinet has ever done. Advocating the purchase of a private stock is as unethical as a cabinet member can possibly get. Not criminal, but criminal is the next step for that kind of behavior. And then there's the guy who said, I'll hook you up to an effing polygraph. Screamed that. How unhinged do you have to be to scream that at an admiral? I'll hook you up to an effing polygraph. That's what the Wall Street Journal is reporting tonight. 44-year-old Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who sounds 14 years old, shouted at Admiral Christopher Grady, who was then the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Grady was never hooked up to a polygraph, despite the profane, screamed threat by the Secretary of Defense. Pete Hegseth promised that he would quit drinking, completely stop, if he was confirmed and became Secretary of Defense. That was his promise. He would stop drinking if he became Secretary of Defense, and implicitly in that promise, he would maybe keep drinking if he didn't become Secretary of Defense. Screaming, "I'll hook you up to an effing polygraph to an admiral," should get you hooked up to a breathalyzer. Any Trump voter can see how incompetent this Secretary of Defense is when he is leaking sensitive information that he claims isn't classified and everyone else in government insists is classified to his wife and to a journalist at The Atlantic. Pete Hegseth has never denied leaking specific combat information to his wife or to a journalist from The Atlantic, but he has said that those battle plans were not classified information. All battle plans have always been classified information. It's why classification was invented. The most protected information in the history of the American government has always been the details of the next combat attack the American government is going to launch. According to Pete Hegseth's brand new definition of classified that has never existed before, General Dwight Eisenhower could have told his wife all about the D-Day invasion and exactly which day in the spring or early summer of 1944 he was thinking about. According to Pete Hegseth's new definition of classified, General Eisenhower could have told his wife when he delayed the invasion by 1 day. He could have told his wife exactly where the invasion was going to be, exactly which beaches in Normandy. The American and British allies spent months and months and months, did a great deal of classified work to try to convince the Germans that they were going to invade Europe at a different location from where they actually did invade Europe. And that location was classified, just like every other location of every other American battle plan. And every one of those details was classified for every minute that those details were being contemplated or planned or carried out. And so even the most uninformed Trump voter in the country, which is probably Donald Trump himself, knows that battle plans have always been classified, and a Secretary of Defense is not supposed to tell anyone about them, very much including his wife. Pete Hegseth is making the stupidity of the Trump administration fully vivid to anyone who might still be having a bit of trouble understanding just how stupid the Trump tariffs are, or how stupid and harmful to international security Donald Trump's switching sides in the war in Ukraine is.
As you may have noticed, the media likes to call it chaos.
"I'll hook you up to an effing polygraph," screamed at an admiral. That could be chaos. That could be rank stupidity. That could be a lot of things. But what the vast majority of Americans know is that that stuff only happens in a Trump administration, and nothing like it has ever happened when anyone else has been president of the United States. Donald Trump's first 100 days will be studied almost as much as Franklin Roosevelt's first 100 days, and they will be studied for the opposite reasons. The Roosevelt 100 days became the model for every subsequent president to aspire to. No president has ever faced greater challenges in his first 100 days than Franklin Roosevelt faced, or accomplished more. No president has ever accomplished more than those first 100 days. No president ever faced an easier first 100 days than Donald Trump. And no president has ever turned the best economy ever handed to an incoming president into a disaster, with predictions of recession and China responding to a trade war with the promise, "We will fight to the end." Donald Trump's friendliest polling operation, the Fox network, has produced the most disastrous report card on any president's first 100 days. In a country that does not teach economics in high school as a required subject and does not teach economics anywhere as a required subject, Donald Trump has always scored well in polling questions about the economy. in a country uneducated about the economy. He's never scored well with people who actually understand the economy and know what tariffs are. But in general polling, he has scored very well on the economy. And that's all over now. Donald Trump destroyed that. Donald Trump destroyed that polling advantage he used to have. In the 94th day of his presidency, according to Fox, 38% of registered voters approve of Donald Trump's handling of the economy. 38%. That number used to be often 20 points higher than that for Donald Trump. Almost always above 50%. Now he's at 38%, and it gets worse. Donald Trump's handling of inflation, the very thing he claimed he was going to fix on the first day of his presidency, the reason so many people voted for him, Donald Trump's handling of inflation has the approval now of just 33% of voters. Same with Donald Trump's tariffs. The candidate who ran for president saying tariff was his favorite word. The candidate who ran for president lying to every voter every day that China would pay the tariffs that Donald Trump's audience would in fact have to pay. Those people who are now listening to radio ads and TV ads from car dealers telling them it's time to run out and get to the dealerships to get the pre-tariff price on cars, those people have turned against Donald Trump, and only 33% approve of Donald Trump's tariffs. 72% now know Donald Trump was lying about tariffs and inflation. 72% correctly believe Donald Trump's tariffs will increase the cost of products, according to the Fox poll. Donald Trump said it himself yesterday, as I pointed out here last night, and it's worth pointing it out again because it's the first time in his life he has ever admitted that a tariff is something added to the price of goods in the United States.
So when you add that to the price of a product, a lot of those products aren't going to sell.
Yeah, you add that to the price of a product. That's right. A tariff is added to the price of a product. And it's also right that a lot of those products won't sell now that they're more expensive, and they won't sell to the Americans who are looking at those products in America with the higher price tags, because the tariffs and the Americans who still have enough money to buy one of those products are the people who will be paying the Trump tariffs. And Donald Trump has said he doesn't care. Donald Trump has said he doesn't care if prices of cars go up. He said, I couldn't care less if they raise prices. Those are his words. Recessions and economic depressions are driven by real economic conditions like insanely high tariffs, but feelings also steer an economy toward a recession. If I'm pessimistic about my personal economic future or the country's economic future, I might decide not to buy a car this year, or not to buy a house this year, or not to buy a new washing machine this year. I might put a lot of buying decisions on hold, and that slows down the economy, and that helps get you to a recession. And Donald Trump is fueling pessimism in this economy, which can help push us toward a recession, with just 32% telling Fox in their poll that Donald Trump's policies are helping the economy. That means most people don't think Donald Trump's policies are helping the economy, and that is going to make them less enthusiastic about helping to fuel that economy with their purchasing power. 71% tell Fox that the economic conditions are fair or poor. 55% told Fox that the economy is getting worse for their families. Donald Trump couldn't possibly win an election now with 55% saying the economy is getting worse for their families because of him, and with virtually all of those people knowing that it's getting worse entirely because of one person, Donald Trump. Donald Trump's reaction to this report card from Fox about his disastrous 94 days in the presidency was, of course, an unhinged Trumpian complaint about the poll itself on social media, saying, Rupert Murdoch has told me for years that he's going to get rid of his Fox News Trump-hating fake pollster, but he has never done so. This pollster has gotten me and MAGA wrong for years also, and while he's at it, he should start making changes at the China-loving Wall Street Journal. The China-loving Wall Street Journal. Imagine if Joe Biden had ever called it the China-loving Wall Street Journal. The screams about Joe Biden's mental competence would be filling the White House press briefing room, filling the Fox studios. Donald Trump appears to be caught in what will be the thousands upon thousands of lies he tells in his second term as president. We might not have an official count of those lies this time because the Washington Post's owner has decided to stop counting them. In the first Trump presidency, Jeff Bezos' Washington Post caught Donald Trump in 30,573 provable lies. And so with that in mind, Donald Trump is claiming that negotiations are underway on a great trade deal with China, but China is saying there are no negotiations, none. The New York Times' David Sanger reports the White House kept hinting that the Chinese were beginning to negotiate, seeking a way to end the tariffs. In fact, the strategy that Beijing appeared to be following was to wait for Mr. Trump to feel the pain of his own actions. The expected phone call from President Xi Jinping never came, and Mr. Trump didn't want to be the first to call either, a sign of desperation. In private, some Trump officials concede that they did not accurately predict China's reaction. Mr. Trump seemed to expect China to be among the first to come begging for relief, given the size of its exports to the United States. CNBC's Eunice Yoon reports from Beijing.
This tougher stance comes as a perception is growing here that the Chinese government is really trying to foment that the Chinese have the upper hand and that President Trump is in a weaker position. The hashtag Trump chickening out has been trending with 250 million views. State TV has also been using one of the memes that has bursted onto the scene here when mocking President Trump officially, calling him the 10,000 tariff grandpa and saying that his constituents have been suffering because of some of his actions. The other memes that are going around, King Know-It-All and Trump the nation builder, but that nation is China.
CNBC reports, quote, at present, there are absolutely no negotiations on the economy and trade between China and the U.S. Ministry of Commerce spokesperson told reporters in Mandarin, translated by CNBC. He added that all sayings regarding progress on bilateral talks should be dismissed. If the U.S. really wants to resolve the problem, it should cancel all unilateral measures on China. And yesterday, a spokesperson for the Chinese government said, we will fight till the end. Donald Trump is not saying we will fight till the end. None of the Trump administration cheerleaders of the tariffs during the first week of the tariffs, none of them is now saying we will fight to the end. Donald Trump's enthusiasm for trying to save TikTok in the United States might weaken now that the China-owned TikTok is filled with anti-Trump tariff posts. And TikTok is not the only humiliation Donald Trump is suffering in China. New York Times reports that in China, the internet is filled with images, videos, music, mostly generated by artificial intelligence, mocking the American leaders for what the Chinese believe are ridiculous and outrageous policies and remarks. Mr. Trump is mocked for expecting a call from Mr. Xi, who's ghosting him to make a trade deal. In a widely shared AI-generated image, a character that looks like Mr. Trump lies on a pink bed in a pastel-colored children's bedroom with his face resting on his hands. He stares at a smartphone. Behind him on the wall is a large portrait of Mr. Xi, smiling. Ha, 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 who's going to call after a breakup? Commented a Weibo user with an internet address in the northwestern province of Gansu. Trump, do you think you're filming a soap opera? Mr. Vance has attracted the most brutal trolling. His peasants comment offended many Chinese in a widely shared AI-generated video. A character resembling Mr. Vance in a pink jacket, pink nails, and hot pink lipstick applies eyeliner while saying in a promotional female tone, cis hillbilly brand eyeliner made in China, reliable quality. Another video shows a cartoon character saying, Vice President Vance, I'm a Chinese peasant. Do you realize your tariff policy will lead to the soaring price of your eyeliner? There are so many posts about the topic that Mr. Vance is now known as the eyeliner man on the Chinese internet. Agreeing with Mitch McConnell didn't used to be such a strange feeling for me. He was a Republican member of the Senate Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over tariffs and taxation. When I was the chief of staff of that committee under the Democratic chairman, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I disagreed with Mitch McConnell completely and always about taxes then and now, but I mostly agreed with him and many other Republicans about tariffs, as did many Democrats. Today, Mitch McConnell made me feel like I was back in the hearing room in the Senate Finance Committee, sitting behind the senators while he said something that every member of the Senate Finance Committee, Democrat and Republican in those days, would have agreed with about tariffs.
I think the public needs to understand this issue is not about exporting jobs. It's a tax increase for everybody. For everybody. That's where the cost will end up being sent. And so this is part of the public education of the impact of a tariff war. It's also, for those who are paying close attention to it, remarkably similar to what happened in the 30s. It was called the Smoot-Hawley-Taft Bill, signed by Herbert Hoover before FDR came into office, which was widely thought to help move the Depression worldwide. And the slogan in the 30s was America First. So we've seen this in history unfold in a way that did not work for us or for other countries. And there's some of us who think, Mr. President, why don't we try something different?